Welcome to Nightfall Tales. Take a slow, gentle breath in and softly let it go. Settle into your bed or favorite chair. Gently close your eyes and let your body relax. As you unwind, I'd love to know where you're listening from, your city or country. Down in the comments. It's so comforting to feel this quiet. Let my voice carry you softly to a place where imagination wanders and calm dreams begin. The observatory sat on the hillside, like a small, warm thought, held against the vast, cold mind of the night. From a distance, if anyone had been walking the frozen lane below at this hour, and no one was, for the village slept its heavy winter sleep, they might have seen a faint amber glow bleeding from the slit in the dome, a small, steady warmth against the black and the cold and the wheeling silence of the stars. The dome was a white hemisphere, round and patient as a closed eye, and through its long opening the stars poured down their ancient light, without measure, without hurry, without the least concern for the small brass instrument that waited below to receive them. Inside, the lamp burned low on the work table. Kerosene, old paper, brass polish. These were the smells of the observatory, layered so deeply into the stone and the wood and the very air that Miriam could not imagine breathing without them. She had breathed this air for 53 years. Since the first night her father had unlocked the narrow door and let her climb the stairs ahead of him, her small hand trailing along the curved stone wall, her heart already loud with the anticipation of something vast. 53 years. The stones knew her footsteps, the stool knew the particular weight of her, the particular way she settled onto it when the night was long and the seeing was good, and there was nowhere else in the world she wished to be. She sat now at the work table, her pen moving slowly across the open page of her logbook. The handwriting was smaller than it had once been. Her eyes required that, but it was steady, precise, each numeral formed with the care of someone who had learned long ago that a single digit transposed could send a calculation spinning into uselessness. Around her, the observatory held its breath. The brass fittings of the great telescope gleamed in the amber lamplight. The slow curve of the tube, the delicate adjustment wheels worn smooth by decades of careful fingers. The eyepiece pointed now toward the southeast, toward Orion climbing the winter sky with his belt of 3 cold stars. The dome was open, and the air that came through it was sharp and clean and tasted faintly of frost, and Miriam breathed it without thinking, the way she breathed everything here, slowly, steadily, as if there were no particular urgency in the world, as if the stars would wait, as if they always had. The clock ticked on the shelf above the work table. Outside, the hillside was entirely still. Somewhere far below, in the valley she could not see, a night bird called once and fell silent. The stars held their steady light. Her routine on clear nights had not changed in decades, and she did not consider this a failing. She had considered it once. In her middle years, when a younger colleague had suggested that routine was the enemy of discovery. She had listened politely and then returned to the observatory and done everything precisely as she always did. And 2 months later, she had recorded an anomaly in the light curve of a variable star that had taken 3 years to fully characterize. Routine, she had come to understand, was not the enemy of discovery. Routine was the net you cast, night after night, into the same dark water. Discovery was what you found in it. She recorded her final observations for the night, the position of a faint cluster she had been tracking through the autumn, now drifting toward the edge of her optimal viewing window, a notation on atmospheric transparency, which had been exceptional tonight. The seeing steady and sharp, a small sketch of a double star she had revisited out of habit and affection. 2 points of light so close together in the eyepiece that they seemed to lean against each other for warmth. She wrote the time in the margin, capped her pen, and sat for a moment in the particular quiet that follows the end of a task when the work is done, and the next thing has not yet begun. Then she rose, with the slight deliberateness of a woman whose joints remembered more cold nights than warm ones, and crossed to the telescope. The ritual of closing was as familiar as breathing. She would lower the eyepiece slightly, a precaution against dew. She would check the drive mechanism, ensure it was disengaged. She would drape the cloth cover over the objective lens, a cloth of midnight, blue wool that she had washed so many times. It was soft now as felt. And then she would turn the dome, the long crank handle worn smooth and cool in her palm, until the opening faced north and the lock engaged with its soft, definitive click. She reached the telescope and set her hand on the body of it, as she always did. A greeting, or a farewell, or simply a habit of touch, the way one sets a hand on the shoulder of an old friend when passing. The brass was cool beneath her palm. The amber light moved over its surface in long, gentle curves as the lamp flame breathed in a draught from the dome opening. And for a moment Miriam simply stood and let the warmth of the lamp and the cold of the incoming air balance each other against her skin, let the tick of the clock and the absolute silence of the hillside hold each other in equal measure. Let the light of the stars above and the light of the lamp below meet somewhere in the middle of the dome. Then she looked at the eyepiece and stopped. There was something resting on it. A small object, or rather 2 small objects, placed with a care that suggested intention. The first was a journal, small, perhaps 4 inches by 6, its cover of dark leather, worn to a softness that spoke of many hands. Around it was tied a ribbon the colour of old gold or autumn grass, or the particular amber of lamplight on brass, a faded, gentle colour, not bright, not demanding, but present. The second object rested beside the journal on the small platform of the focuser, an acorn, a single, perfect acorn, its cap still attached, its body smooth and brown and dense, catching the lamplight with a faint sheen, as if it had been polished or as if it were simply the kind of thing that held light without effort. Miriam stood quite still for a long moment. The clock ticked. The observatory breathed. She had looked through the eyepiece less than an hour ago. She had recorded the double star at 11:47. She knew this precisely. She had written the time herself, and the platform had been empty. She had not heard the door. She had not heard the stairs. She was not, she thought, the kind of woman who failed to hear things in the quiet of this room, where the smallest sounds were amplified by stone and silence into something almost visible. She was also not the kind of woman who leaped to explanations. The journal was here. The acorn was here. Someone had placed them. The when and the how of it could wait. They were, in the end, the least interesting part. She lifted the journal carefully. The leather was cool against her fingers, and very soft, the kind of softness that accumulates not from being kept carefully, but from being handled often, turned in many palms, tucked into many pockets, carried against many bodies, across many different kinds of weather. The gold ribbon was tied in a simple bow, and she untied it with the same fingers that had spent a lifetime untying the finest adjustments of focus, the smallest calibrations of arc and degree, and it came loose without resistance, as if it had been waiting to be opened. The pages were cream, coloured slightly foxed at the edges, filled from the first page to somewhere past the middle with handwriting. Many different hands. She could see that at once from the way the ink shifted in colour and quality, from the way the characters changed their shapes from page to page, some large and looping, some small and cramped, some in the careful copperplate of a formal education, and some in the unpractised but earnest print of someone who had learnt to write later than most many hands. But only one sentence, the same sentence, written by each hand in turn, filling the page and turning to the next, the same words in an infinite patient repetition. I looked up because someone showed me how. Miriam read it 3 times. Then she sat down on the stool. The journal was open in her lap, and she turned the pages slowly, not reading. She had understood the sentence at once. It required no further reading, but looking at the handwriting, and it was then on the 4th or 5th page that she felt the ground shift slightly beneath her, the way it shifted sometimes when a long calculation resolved itself and showed her something she had not expected, because she recognized one of the hands. Her father's, she knew it by the way. He made his lowercase e, closing it with a small precise hook that she had noticed as a child and never forgotten. It was there on the page, 4 lines from the top. I looked up because someone showed me how. His ink was brown with age, his letters smaller than she remembered them being in his letters to her, but it was his hand, she was certain. She turned more pages. On a page near the middle, she found her mentor's writing, the wide, confident strokes of a man who had never doubted that what he had to say was worth reading. The letters slightly forward, leaning as if in a hurry to arrive. Professor Aldous Vane, who had taken her on as a research assistant at 22 and kept her for 6 years and never once, in all that time, suggested that an observatory might not be the right place for her. I looked up because someone showed me how. Then she found her own. She did not remember writing it. She was quite certain she had not written it, had never held this journal before tonight, had never seen it before. It appeared on the eyepiece an hour ago, but the handwriting was hers, unmistakably. The particular way she formed her L with a small serif at the base that had been a mannerism of her girlhood pen and had persisted through every decade since. The ink was her colour, the deep blue-black she had used for 30 years, and the words were the words I looked up because someone showed me how. The stars held their steady light. Outside, the hillside was silent and cold and enormous, and Miriam sat on her stool in the amber glow and held the journal in her hands and took a slow, deep breath. She did not move for a long while. This was not unusual for her. She had always been comfortable with stillness, had cultivated it the way other people cultivated conversation, had found in it not emptiness, but a kind of fullness, a space in which things could settle and be seen clearly. Students who came to the observatory, expecting a teacher who would fill every silence with instruction, often found instead a woman who would simply hand them the eyepiece and step back and wait. And the waiting was its own teaching, more effective than any explanation. She sat on the stool with the journal open in her lap, and the silence of the observatory gathered around her like something warm. I looked up because someone showed me how. Her father had been a quiet man, not reserved. He had laughed easily and often, had told long wandering stories after dinner, had sung to himself in the garden without self-consciousness, but quiet in the way of people who are comfortable with the weight of things, who do not feel the need to lighten every moment with words. He had taken her outside on a January night when she was 6 years old, the cold so sharp she could feel it in her teeth, and he had crouched down behind her and set his hands gently on her shoulders and pointed upward with one finger past her ear toward the north. That one, he had said, do you see the bright one just there? That is the North Star. No matter where you are, if you can find that star, you know which way is north. She had stared at it for a long time, the cold and the dark and the immensity of the sky pressing against her small self. And then she had said, why doesn't it move? And he had said, that is a very good question. Let us find out together. They had spent the next 3 years finding out together. He had borrowed books from the village library and bought star charts from the city and assembled, piece by piece, a small brass spyglass that he had set up on the flat roof of the garden shed, and they had looked through it on every clear night, her eye to the lens and his voice behind her naming what she saw. He was not an astronomer, he was a watchmaker, but he knew how to teach patience and precision, and the particular satisfaction of a thing understood clearly. And these were, It turned out exactly the skills the sky required. When she was 9, the observatory on the hill above the village had opened its doors for a public evening, and her father had taken her, and she had looked through the great telescope for the first time, and she had seen Saturn. She had not spoken for nearly a minute. The rings were real. She had read about them, had seen drawings, had formed in her mind some pale approximation of the thing. But the thing itself, floating in the dark circle of the eyepiece, cream, coloured and ringed, and somehow both delicate and enormous, a world that wore its mystery visibly, that had silenced her in a way that nothing had silenced her before or since, a silence not of absence, but of the absolute fullness of seeing. Behind her, the astronomer who ran the observatory had waited patiently. He was an old man then, or seemed old to her 9-year old self. His name was Dr. Harmon, and she did not know yet that he would become the most important teacher of her life, that she would sit in his observatory for 6 winters learning the sky, that he would write her the letter of recommendation that brought her to Professor Vane, that he would come to her own observatory 20 years later and stand at the door and say, in his dry, unhurried way, "I think you may have surpassed me, and I could not be more pleased." She did not know any of that yet. She only knew that someone had let her look through this telescope and that the universe had opened like a door. I looked up because someone showed me how. She turned the pages again, more slowly. How many entries were there? She counted 47 at least, possibly more. Some pages held 2 entries, some 1, and the ink varied so much in age and quality that she could not tell. In some cases, whether a faint, nearly vanished inscription was very old or merely written with a failing pen. 47 people at least who had looked through a telescope. This telescope, she believed, because here it was, and here they were, and had wanted afterward to say so, to say, "I looked up. Someone showed me. I want that recorded somewhere to be known." She thought of the children. There had been so many children, the school groups, one Wednesday morning, per month from September through May, a rotating collection of classes from the village school and the schools in the surrounding villages, children ranging in age from 7 to 14 and ranging in temperament from wild enthusiasm to elaborate performance grade boredom. She had developed over the years a reliable method for the bored ones. She did not try to persuade them. She simply let them look. Boredom, she had found, did not survive contact with Saturn's rings. It could survive descriptions of Saturn's rings, diagrams of Saturn's rings, even quite good photographs of Saturn's rings. But the rings themselves, seen through the eyepiece of a real telescope, with one's own eye, in the dark of a real observatory, with the cold air coming through the dome, and the smell of kerosene and old brass, and the tick of the clock, these things were, in Miriam's experience, more or less proof against any level of affected disinterest. She thought of a girl, perhaps 11 or 12, who had come with a school group in the early spring of the previous decade. Miriam could not remember the year precisely, but she remembered the frost on the dome that morning, the air smelling of thaw and cold earth, the particular quality of the light. The girl had stood at the back of the group, with her arms folded and her expression carefully arranged to communicate that she had not chosen to be here and could not be expected to perform enthusiasm. Miriam had let her be. She had taken the other children through the routine, the explanation of the telescope, the demonstration of the focuser, the careful single-file approach to the eyepiece, the small gasp from nearly every one of them when they saw the moon close up. Each crater a shadow and a highlight, the surface not flat as a photograph, but somehow present, somehow textured, somehow near. The girl had watched from the back with her arms still folded. When the others were done, Miriam had simply moved to the eyepiece and adjusted the focus and stepped aside without a word. The girl had looked at her for a moment. Then she had walked forward and put her eye to the lens. Behind her, the astronomer who ran the observatory had waited patiently. He was an old man then, or seemed old to her 9-year-old self. His name was Dr. Harmon, and she did not know yet that he would become the most important teacher of her life, that she would sit in his observatory for 6 winters learning the sky, that he would write her the letter of recommendation that brought her to Professor Vane, that he would come to her own observatory 20 years later and stand at the door and say, in his dry, unhurried way, "I think you may have surpassed me, and I could not be more pleased." She did not know any of that yet. She only knew that someone had let her look through this telescope and that the universe had opened like a door. I looked up because someone showed me how. She turned the pages again, more slowly. How many entries were there? She counted 47, at least, possibly more. Some pages held 2 entries, some 1, and the ink varied so much in age and quality that she could not tell. In some cases, whether a faint, nearly vanished inscription was very old or merely written with a failing pen. 47 people at least, who had looked through a telescope. This telescope, she believed, because here it was, and here they were, and had wanted afterward to say so. To say, "I looked up, someone showed me, I want that recorded somewhere, to be known." She thought of the children. There had been so many children, the school groups, one Wednesday morning, per month, from September through May, a rotating collection of classes from the village school and the schools in the surrounding villages, children ranging in age from 7 to 14 and ranging in temperament from wild enthusiasm to elaborate performance, grade boredom. She had developed over the years a reliable method for the bored ones. She did not try to persuade them. She simply let them look boredom. She had found did not survive contact with Saturn's rings. It could survive descriptions of Saturn's rings, diagrams of Saturn's rings, even quite good photographs of Saturn's rings. But the rings themselves, seen through the eyepiece of a real telescope, with one's own eye, in the dark of a real observatory, with the cold air coming through the dome and the smell of kerosene and old brass and the tick of the clock. These things were, in Miriam's experience, more or less proof against any level of affected disinterest. She thought of a girl, perhaps 11 or 12, who had come with a school group in the early spring of the previous decade. Miriam could not remember the year precisely, but she remembered the frost on the dome that morning, the air smelling of thaw and cold earth, the particular quality of the light. The girl had stood at the back of the group, with her arms folded and her expression carefully arranged to communicate that she had not chosen to be here and could not be expected to perform enthusiasm. Miriam had let her be. She had taken the other children through the routine, the explanation of the telescope, the demonstration of the focuser, the careful single-file approach to the eyepiece, the small gasp from nearly every one of them when they saw the moon close up. Each crater a shadow and a highlight, the surface not flat as a photograph, but somehow present, somehow textured. The girl had watched from the back, with her arms still folded. When the others were done, Miriam had simply moved to the eyepiece and adjusted the focus and stepped aside without a word. The girl had looked at her for a moment. Then she had walked forward and put her eye to the lens. She had not gasped. She had made no sound at all, but she had stayed at the eyepiece for longer than any of the others, perhaps 2 full minutes, which felt very long in the particular silence of an observatory. And when she finally stepped back, her arms were no longer folded. She looked at the telescope and then at Miriam. And Miriam had said nothing, because there was nothing to say, because the telescope had already said it. The girl had nodded once with a seriousness that was not the seriousness of performance, but of something encountered and acknowledged. And then she had rejoined the group and filed out into the cold spring morning. Miriam had thought of her sometimes. Over the years she had thought, perhaps she became an astronomer, perhaps she became a poet, perhaps she became a plumber, who remembered once in a while that the moon had craters, that the surface was real, that someone had shown her. Perhaps she had written in this journal, in some hand Miriam could not identify, in some ink she could not date. I looked up because someone showed me how. Her mentor, Professor Vane, had not been a gentle man. She thought of him now with great affection and a clear memory of his less sentimental qualities, his impatience with imprecision, his discomfort with emotion, his habit of walking away from conversations he found unproductive mid-sentence without apology. He had not been easy to learn from. He had required her to be better than she knew she could be, which was, she understood now, one of the more demanding forms of respect. He had never told her she was doing well. He had told her twice in 6 years that she was not wrong. She had understood both times that this was the same as a standing ovation. He had taught her to see patterns, not just in the data. She had already learned that from Dr. Harmon, but in the work itself, in the process of looking. The sky was not a collection of objects to be catalogued, he said. It was a language to be read, and reading required not just knowledge of the letters, but a feeling for the grammar, the way the parts related to each other, the way meaning accumulated, not in individual points of light, but in the spaces between them, in the motion and the relationship and the deep, long arc of time. He had shown her how to hold a question in her mind without trying to answer it immediately, how to let the data speak in its own time, how to sit with uncertainty as if it were a companion rather than an obstacle. She had not thanked him properly. This was one of the small, mild regrets of her life. He had died when she was 38, a stroke in his study, surrounded by papers. She had gone to the memorial and said the appropriate things, and had not said the other things, the things that required more honesty than the occasion seemed to permit. That he had changed the way she saw, not just the sky, but everything. That his impatience had been a form of love, that she still heard his voice in her head when she was being sloppy with a measurement. She had not said these things. She had come back to the observatory and looked at the stars for a very long time. But here was his handwriting. In this journal, in this steady, confident, forward-leaning script. I looked up because someone showed me how, and she understood something she had not understood before, or had understood without having the words for it. He had had a teacher too. Of course he had. Everyone who looked up had been shown by someone how to look. The chain went back and back, further than she could trace, further than the journal could record, back to the first person who had pointed at the sky and said to the child beside them, "Look, just there. Do you see?" She thought of all the names she knew, and all the names she did not. She thought of the unknown teacher who had first shown her father a star atlas. She thought of whoever it was who had taught Dr. Harmon to see Saturn not as a point of light, but as a world. She thought of the chain of it, the long, unbroken chain of looking and showing, of someone stepping aside from the eyepiece and letting the next person through, of the gesture, simple, unremarkable, endlessly repeated, of saying, "I see something, come and see." The observatory was quiet around her. The brass gleamed in the amber glow. The dome turned its patient arc above, holding the stars in its open mouth. The clock ticked, and the night moved in its great slow rotation, and Miriam sat on her stool and held the journal, and something in her chest that had been, perhaps without her knowing it, slightly unfinished. Some sentence begun in childhood and never quite completed, settled into its final clause and came to rest. She was 81 years old. She had given her eyes to this sky for 53 years. She had her father's patience and her mentor's precision and Dr. Harmon's gift for standing back and waiting, for letting the telescope speak for itself. She had taught, she did not know how many people, children and students, and the occasional adult who came up the hill with a tentative curiosity they were not sure would be welcomed. She had taught them all the same way, by showing them the eyepiece and stepping aside and trusting the sky to do the rest. She had not thought of this as a gift. It was simply what one did when one had been shown. I looked up because someone showed me how. She thought, yes. And then she thought, and I showed others because someone showed me. And the thought was so simple, so plain, so entirely without drama, that she almost smiled. She reached for her pen. It was the pen she used for the logbook. The same deep blue black ink, the same careful nib, the same hand that had written hundreds of thousands of words about the sky over the decades. She opened the journal to the next blank page. She did not hesitate. She wrote in her own hand, with her own ink, in her own steady and slightly compressed script. And I showed others because someone showed me. She looked at the words for a moment. They sat on the page cleanly, without flourish, exactly what they needed to be. She capped the pen. She closed the journal, the soft leather cover yielding under her fingers, the pages settling together with a sound like a slow breath, and she tied the ribbon back around it, the faded gold ribbon, the bow inexact but deliberate. She held it in both hands for a moment. The weight of it, the warmth it had acquired from her palms, the worn and patient and entirely unassuming object that had passed through how many hands she could not know, that had waited in how many pockets and on how many shelves, that had been opened by how many people who had looked through this particular telescope and felt the need to say, I want it known. Someone showed me. It mattered. She held it and felt not pride exactly, and not grief exactly, but something in the country between them, a feeling of great, quiet fullness, of a thing that had been worth doing, of time well spent. She crossed to the shelf beside the logbooks. The logbooks stood in a long, organized row, each one labelled in her hand with the years it covered, the spines faded and the corners soft. They held 53 years of sky, 53 years of careful observation, every variable star and double star and nebula and comet and meteor she had watched from this dome. She set the journal at the end of the row, where the logbooks ended and the open shelf began, in the place where the next logbook would eventually stand. It looked as if it had always been there. It looked as if it belonged. She looked at it for a moment on the shelf, and then she went back to the eyepiece. The acorn was still on the platform, small and dense and perfect, its cap fitting it like a hat that had been made for it and nothing else. She picked it up and held it in her palm. It was heavier than she expected, the weight of a complete thing, of something that had everything it needed already inside it. She turned it in her fingers, the smooth, cool body, the rough and intricate cap, The small point, an acorn. She had planted acorns as a child, or tried to. She had put them in the earth with great ceremony and impatience, and had been unable to resist the weekly temptation to dig them up again to check their progress, which was not. It turned out a useful approach to growing oaks. She had learned patience later, from the sky, from the slow business of watching and waiting and trusting that what was growing would grow. She carried the acorn to the work table and moved aside a small stack of star charts to clear a space on the windowsill, the east-facing window, the window through which she would see the dawn when it came. She set the acorn in a small ceramic dish, the kind she usually used for pen nibs and small spare parts, and placed it on the sill where the light, when it came, would find it. A seed, a thing that required patience, a thing that would become long after she was gone, something that took up more space in the world than anything she could precisely envision. She thought, yes, that is about right. She turned back to the telescope, and she completed what she had set out to do when she first crossed the room. She lowered the eyepiece, she checked the drive mechanism, she drew the midnight blue cloth over the objective lens, with the same gentle care she would use to cover a sleeping child. Not that she had ever been prone to such comparisons, but the night was late, and the silence was deep, and the telescope was, after all, an old and trusted companion, and companions deserved a certain tenderness in the late hours. Then she turned to the dome crank. The handle was cool and familiar in her palm, smooth where 53 years of hands had smoothed it. She turned it slowly, the dome responding with its familiar sequence of sounds. First, the low creak of the rollers, then the steady, rhythmic turning, then the soft click of the lock as the opening came to face north, and the mechanism engaged. The stars visible in the last moment of the dome's turning wheeled once across the slit and were gone. The dome sealed. The cold air lessened. The silence inside became different, deeper, enclosed. The silence of a room rather than the silence of a hillside. And Miriam stood for a moment in this new quiet and let it settle around her. The amber lamp still burned on the work table. She crossed to it and stood with her hand on the glass chimney, not yet touching it, just standing in the warmth of its small circle. The observatory looked the way it always looked in these last minutes before she extinguished the lamp. Everything familiar, everything in its place, the logbooks on the shelf and now the journal among them, the charts on the table and the tools on their hooks and the great telescope in its cloth in the centre of the dome, patient as a sleeping animal, waiting for the next clear night. She had stood here like this, in this last moment before the dark, more times than she could count. It was one of the small, regular rituals of her life. This pause between the light and the dark, this last look at the room she had spent her best hours in. She looked at the journal on the shelf, she thought. It will wait. That is what it does. It waits for the next person who looks through the telescope, who feels the need to say, in whatever hand they have, in whatever ink. I was here, I looked up. Someone showed me. It will wait on the shelf, and the right person will find it. The way the right people always find the things they need, if those things are left in the right places. She extinguished the lamp. The darkness was not complete. A faint, residual glow from somewhere. The stars perhaps leaking through the seams of the dome, or her eyes simply adjusting, and she stood in it for a moment, in the dark and the quiet and the smell of kerosene, and old brass and cold air, and she felt the night around her, like something that had waited all along for her to stop moving, to simply be still inside it. Then she crossed to the door and descended the narrow stairs to the cottage. The kitchen was cold, the fire in the range burned to ash. She made it quietly, the creak of the range door, the soft fall of kindling, the scratch of a match, and while it caught she filled the kettle and set it on the back of the range, and stood in the kitchen in her coat and gloves, too tired to remove them yet, watching the fire establish itself. Through the east-facing kitchen window, the sky above the hill showed the first, most tentative suggestion of change. Not light, not yet, but a faint lessening of the absolute dark, a thinning, as if the night were considering its options. She made the tea slowly, in the unhurried way of someone who has arrived at the hour where slowness is not a concession, but an achievement. The kettle's whisper, the click of the teapot lid, the faint bloom of steam in the cold air. She poured and waited and poured again, and carried the cup to the chair by the window, the chair she sat in every morning for as long as she could remember, the chair that knew the shape of her as well as the stool in the observatory did. She sat. She wrapped both hands around the cup. She looked at the window. The sky was lightening. She could see it now. The definite beginning of something, a grey-blue softness, spreading from the east, separating the hill from the sky in a way that the full dark had not permitted. In an hour the sun would clear the hill, and the dome on the observatory above the cottage would catch the light, and the brass fittings would catch it too, and the white stone of the cottage would be warm and ordinary in the early morning. But for now there was just this, the lightning, the slow and certain lightning, the sky becoming a different kind of quiet. On the windowsill of the kitchen window, which faced east, she had set a small collection of objects, a smooth river stone, a fragment of sea glass, a small pine cone from the hillside, a brass ring that had been the cap of a lens she had used for 20 years before replacing it. She went to the windowsill now and moved the pine cone slightly to the left, and set the ceramic dish with the acorn in its place, in the centre of the sill, where the first light, when it came, would fall directly on it. She looked at it for a moment. The acorn on the sill in the dark kitchen, waiting for the light. She went back to her chair. She sat, she drank her tea in small sips, watching the window, watching the sky accomplish its slow and inevitable transformation From the dark it had been all night to the pale pearl, edged particular blue of a winter dawn. The stars were gone, or nearly. The brightest were holding on, the last stubborn presences, but they were losing their argument with the light, the way they always did, the way they always would. Up on the hillside, the dome sat closed and white, the telescope sleeping inside it. The journal sat on the shelf beside the logbooks, its gold ribbon faded, its pages full, and its blank pages ready, waiting for the next hand, the next ink, the next person who would look up through the eyepiece into the dark and feel the rings of Saturn, or the craters of the moon, or the doubled stars leaning together, and want to say to anyone who came after, to everyone who came after, I was here, I looked, someone showed me how. The chain ran backward into time as far as time went, and forward into time as far as time could reach, and Miriam sat in her chair by the window and felt herself a single link in it. No more than that, and no less. Exactly that. A link held between the link before her and the link that would come after, the connection between what she had been given and what the pass-through of a gift so old and so fundamental that it could not be said to belong to anyone. You looked up, someone showed you. Then you showed someone else. You stepped back from the eyepiece and let them see. This was the entire thing. This was the whole of it. Miriam finished her tea. The cup was warm in her hands and then not warm, and she set it on the small table beside the chair and settled more deeply into the cushions. Through the window, the sky had become unmistakably blue, the particular thin, clean blue of a winter morning. The hill now clearly defined against it, the bare trees on the ridge black and intricate against the pale sky. The first light was on the dome. She could see it just at the crest of the hill, a pale gleam on the white stone, the first brightening. She did not intend to sleep. She was simply going to sit for a while in the warm kitchen, in the chair that knew her shape, and watch the dawn come in over the hill. She was simply going to rest her eyes for a moment, in the way one rests them after a long night of careful looking, giving them the relief of ordinary light, of near distances, of the simple and undemanding world of the kitchen, and the window and the brightening sky. The acorn on the sill caught the first light of morning, a pale golden gleam, precise as the tip of a needle, as the first star of evening, and held it, and Miriam saw it from the corner of her closed eyes, or dreamed it, or both, the way the light finds every patient thing that has waited for it, the way it always has, the way it always will. On the shelf in the observatory above, the journal waited. The logbooks stood in their patient row, 53 years of sky. The telescope slept in its cloth, its brass dreaming of the night to come, of the dome opening again, of another eye at the eyepiece, of another hand reaching for the focuser, of someone looking up for the first time, or the 10,000th time, and seeing what was there. The quiet work continued. It had always continued. It would continue long after the lamp was cold, and the logbooks were read by other eyes, and the dome had been opened and closed by other hands. The sky did not care about the passing of particular observers. It was indifferent and vast and entirely extravagantly full of things worth seeing. But the people who had cared about each other, had always cared, had left their records in logbooks and journals, and in the memories of the children who had stood on tiptoes to reach the eyepiece, and had gasped. That sound, that particular small sound, always the same, always new, at the rings of Saturn, the craters of the moon, the two stars so close they seemed to lean against each other for warmth in the enormous, cold, and endlessly generous dark. Miriam slept in her chair. The acorn caught the light. The dome held the sleeping telescope in its round, white, patient arms, and the morning came on quietly, and the stars, in their ancient and incalculable numbers, held their steady light on the other side of the bright sky, waiting for the dark again, waiting for the dome to open, waiting for the one who would come and put their eye to the glass and see, for the first time or the 10, what has always been there. The quiet work of showing others would continue. It had been written down. It was known. I looked up because someone showed me how, and I showed others because someone showed me.